So let me check if the live session has started or not. Just give me a second. Mm, okay. Okay, we are live now. Okay, we are live now.
Okay.
Okay, so um, good evening, everyone. Good evening, friends, and thank you for staying with us. And welcome to the third webinar. Just give me a second. To the third webinar of this year, and we are gathered here not merely for an academic exercise but confronting urgent cultural formation, the so-called resistible rise of the far-right theater in India, as such just stated. And it is an honor and pleasure for me to host Professor Brahma Prakash, sir, from the Department of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. And we are especially grateful to have him with us again. And we look forward to a lecture that will not only diagnose or engage with this theatrical movement, but also interrogate the various, the very conditions that make such a rise possible and resistible as well. So, without any further delay, before sir starts giving his lecture, I would like to make a few things clear. First, the entire, this webinar will be recorded. That's the first thing. And secondly, you can post your questions or comments in the comment section box, but please make sure that the questions you make are to the point, and try to be precise as well. So without any further delay, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Navonil, and thank you everyone whoever could have joined, and of course, so this is a new work that I am doing. I'll just give you an idea about this is a part of the section that I'm going to present for you is a small part of my larger project that I've been doing, and it is around the Hindutva, or you can say far right cultural productions in which I'm talking about. And here I'm going to present to you a small sections where we are going to talk about, and the title is Resistible Rise of the Far Right Theater in India. Because whenever we think about theater, then we think about either progressive theater, or we think about more sorts of left theater, and that has been the part of tradition. So either we are thinking about Indian history of Indian People's Theatre Association, or even if you're thinking about many forms of social justice theatre in many parts of India, from Maharashtra to UP to other parts of India. But something that we are witnessing is something very, very new, and that is the focus of this talk. And that is where I am trying to take your attention to. And the title is called The Resistible Rise of the Far Right Theatre in India. And that is going to be my focus. But also, I'm working on a book called A Spectacle Estate. In A Spectacle Estate, I'm largely talking about some kinds of right-wing cultural productions of far right or Hindutva cultural productions, because there has been a lot of writings around political formation and a lot of writings around ideological formation of Hindutva. But I think the way Hindutva is able to penetrate the cultural sphere, social spheres, that attention has been that is not paid so much less, that has got very less attention. And that is where I'm talking about A Spectacle Estate, and the book should be coming very soon. It's called A Spectacle Estate: how far right, how Hindutva shapes feeling and culture in India. So, but again, this is some kinds of digression that I'm trying to make, because not necessarily the things that I'm presenting to you is a part of the book that is going to come. So here I'm going to talk about, and some parts, a small section has come already came in EPW, and so I'm also going to discuss that part a little bit. So here I'm discussing about the rise of the new theater genre that can be termed as the far right theater with all its characteristics. from the mode of representation to forms of engagement and aesthetics dimensions. Scholars have discussed the performance of the far right, and so you have some of the scholarship that I could see, because far right has been a kind of global movement now, almost either you are talking about United States, you are talking about India. It has been a part of global cultural phenomena in which it is taking shape. And but again, largely the scholars who have paid attention to, largely who have discussed about the far right formation, their focus has been largely on some different kinds of cultural production. Their focus has been largely on the theatricality of the leader, or theatricality of some kinds of cultural fashion, food, or other kinds of things. But not much attention has been paid to the theater itself, with some exception, including the work of, you have very interesting work of Aparna Mahiaria, and she has done some interesting work on how a street theater has been appropriated in Delhi by right-wing forces, and that has been very few fragmented works that we can talk about. Otherwise, this far-right cultural production has not been a site of many of the scholarly debate. So in this talk, I intend to offer an overview of far-right theatre in India and how it has made a considerable presence in theatre scene and almost developed as a just genre that can be termed as a far-right theatre in parallel to H-pop. Now, if you are aware about that, how cultural productions of right wing is working, then you have already have Hindutva pop or H-pop, what is called H-pop, and you have brilliant book by Kunal Purohit where he talks about H-pop and how it is becoming almost a popular genre in music industry. So in parallel to Hindutva pop, or you also have propaganda cinema, Hindutva cinema, and that kinds of cinema that either you're talking about now Dhurandhar 2, or you're talking about several other kinds of Kashmir File and Kerala File, that has all been part of that kinds of productions. So this debate has somehow came in cinema, cinema in when some there has been some engagement about cultural productions that is happening at the level of cinema or different other kinds of media. But I think that when it comes to theater, then we have not discussed so much. But if you go to watch theater now, at least I can see from Delhi scenario, that if you go to watch theater now in Delhi, either you're going to watch a street theater, you're going to watch a stage theater, you can see that whole some kinds of penetration of right wing ideology is very much there, and they are really they are calling it a movement. It's a right wing kinds of movement, of far right theater movement, in which we can talk about these theater formations or these kinds of new genre formations. So whether one likes it or not, it has led to a considerable change in the way one engages with the theater, and the theater engages with the actors, spectators, and public at large. So I'm talking about two things. One, that we already have a history of left-wing theater. We already have a history of some kinds of theater historiography in which theater has been discussed. But again, the question we are asking is two kinds. One, that is it right-wing theater is just some kinds of another avatar of some kinds of left-wing theater? Is it similar kind, when we, because when we discuss about left-wing theater, then there has been also some kinds of considerable debate about propaganda theater, how left-wing is a propaganda theater or that kinds of theater. So is it a similar kinds of propaganda that right-wing is also doing, or is it a different kinds of formation in which we can talk about these kinds of right-wing kinds of theater that is emerging here? So whether so along with this so what is the crux of the theater that we can talk about? So it has religiosity. It has I will say counter revolution, because either you are thinking in terms of gender, either you are thinking about some kinds of debates of equality. It is trying to make some kind of backlash, in terms of the backlash we can talk about, because it goes against the gender ideology, it goes against the some kinds of norms of equality, it goes against the some of the things that democratic rights that one could have talked about, and that becomes the sites of perpetuation of theater. So far right theater also produces what can be termed as a, for me, counter theater aesthetic. So one I'm talking about, so is it not just we, when we are talking about far right theater, then we are not only talking about some kinds of theater, we are also talking about some kinds of new formation of aesthetics that I would like to term as a counter theater aesthetics itself. And then I would like to take you to some kinds of debate that has been part of theater history. And this debate came in around 2007 2006 in UK in a quite interesting way. You have British cultural critic J. Reiner, and J. Reiner, he was asking this question, that where is the theater of the right? So there was a whole debate that he could, whether is it condition can theater can go right it that time it was looking quite impossible that you can also have a theater of the right, and that is what Renner was asking. So for many critics, the right wing theater was out of imagination. Theater and far right looks like an oxymoron, both for aesthetics region and regions of the radical left legacies of the theater itself. Reiner underlined almost total failure of imagination when it comes to working out what a play from the right might actually look like. And that was his feeling. So one wanted to really see some kinds of that if there is going to be right wing theater, then how it going to appear like. And that was the kinds of debate in which Reiner was asking. And then also we have theater director of National Theatre of UK, and his name was Nicholas Heitner. He gave a call. In fact, he gave a call in 2006 to have a good mischievous right wing play. And he was saying that is there a possibility to bring good mischievous right wing play, because there was a whole kinds of disenchantment among British circle that left wing theater is too much. It is the same repetition that is happening. We are perhaps engaging with the very similar kinds of aesthetics. So is there a possibility that one can generate a right wing theater? And therefore, Heitner was asking that is it a possibility to have good mischievous right wing play. And then you also have a conservative supporting actor and Oscar winning playwright, Julian Fellows, and she suggested that the establishment of the left needs to be challenged by the new avant garde. And then when he's talking about new avant garde, then he was talking about that is there a possibility that we can challenge the theater of the left by theater of the right? And these were the debates that was coming in a very fragmented ways, but thinking about that there is no possibility of the right wing theater at all. So there was a whole imagination in which one was talking that perhaps there is a one cannot think about, one could not have thought about the right wing plays in that sense. But that is what is getting completely subverted now when we are talking about the far right theater or resistible rise of the far right theater in India, where you have proper genre that can be termed as a far right theater or Hindutva theater for that matter. Not having right wing theater in an increasingly far right ecosystem appear like an irony. So when you are thinking about that, the way the whole things have recently shifted. So you have a far right government across the world, but far right government across the world, how can it be possible that you have far right government, you have far right popular culture, but you cannot have far right culture, far right theater? And that was another paradox in which they were talking about the possibility of far right theater in a global context. So while the theater of the far right has gone pervasive in the forms of rhetorical, spectacle, and popular culture, so still when critics talk about this whole idea of the far right theater, then the debate is largely about they are talking about theater of the far right. And when I'm saying I'm making a distinction between theater of the far right, so for example, the way leaders behaves, the way you have whole theatricality or cult figure in democracy, and they can still be analyzed through some kinds of theater of the far right or theater of the right for that matter. But that is not the questions I'm trying to answer. So theater of the far right, when we are talking about theater of the far right, we are talking about the large cultural productions of the right wing, in which we can talk about the theater of the far right. So one can talk about a spectacle, one can talk about some kinds of fashion, one can talk about all different kinds of culture, in which one can bring the theater of the far right is a more, I will say that more general category or more broad category in which we can talk about the theater of the far right. But when I'm talking about far right theater, then it means I'm talking about proper genre of theater. I'm focusing on proper genre of theater in which these theaters are emerging. And now you have I have two students of mine who came Chachari, and they have written two pieces in seeing one production of Vividsa Tamas. So Tamas is a famous play or famous text by Bhishma Sani, and now the play was enacted by play was directed in NSD recently, and then that brought up a new debate about that how there is a whole idea that you are incorporating, you are bringing some kinds of play that has a whole radical history, that has a whole left history, and now you are trying to give it a new kinds of meaning by in implicating those plays in some kinds of full of ideology of hate. And that is what Laksha and Prem Bats has noted, that how the staging turned the text into something painful and unjust for his admirer. So he says Prem Batsi is saying that how something that is becoming really really painful. So watching theater itself becomes a painful. So suppose that if you watch Tamas and if you know the complexities of that text, or to that whole ideological kinds of political kinds of take of Vishnu Sahni, and when you are going to watch this theater, then it really becomes painful and really becomes violent itself. Same way, Lakshya Chaudhary, he also talks about that how these theaters are trying to do some kinds of systematic hollowing of the theater institutions, that systematic hollowing of the theater institutions. And that is what I also discuss in my book, A Spectacle Stage, that when we talk about a spectacle, then a spectacle can be seen in very different ways. One, that a spectacle attempts to hollow out the politics. It tries to hollow out the histories. It tries to hollow out the aesthetics. So it becomes an act of hollowing out, where you're trying to make very superficial connections in black and white, in us and then, and that becomes a very ideological kinds of a structure through which you are trying to mobilize these kinds of theater. The production aimed to appease the regime and join the chorus of hyper nationalism, and that becomes a very a core theme if you're going to watch these theaters. It also showed how the far right is moving from censoring the artworks to engaging and appropriating them in all brilliant ways. So earlier, if you know the history of the right wing in India, then they will do try to censor the artwork. They will try to vandalize the artwork. You have M.F. Hussain painting that was vandalized, and that was some kinds of intervention by the right wing, where they will usually come to vandalize. They will come to censor these kinds of things through some kinds of mobilization. But now they are making they're also a strategy. In terms of a strategy, they are making a new kinds of shift. In new kinds of shift, they are trying to engage with the text, but it is not an engagement. Engagement becomes a very a paradox, in which by engaging with the text, so by engaging with Tamas, what exactly they have done by engaging with Tamas play, you are trying to emptying out the play itself, the gist of the play itself, or some kinds of ideology of the play itself, and that becomes one ways of thinking about their intervention, that you engage. But by the way, if you are engaging with Ambedkarite ideology or Ambedkar's ideology, then very engagement becomes some kinds of interesting, one can say, very paradoxical disengagement, when you are trying to empty out the ideology itself. So either it is a question of engaging with Tamas or engaging with Ambedkar, it becomes just a kind of act of emptying out and creating some kinds of a spectacle out of that engagement. And that is one of the ways we can think about their engagement. The play was an exception rather than an example of a new theater. So what I'm trying to say, that one, that Thomas is, of course, is an example, interesting example, but it is Thomas kinds of things that you can see across, in either they are doing right wing is doing a street theater, right wing is doing a stage theater. This becomes one of the modes to engage with these kinds of plays, where not necessarily you have written the play, but you are taking out, you are engaging with the existing plays, engaging with the existing scripts, and now trying to empty it out from its own ideology. A model of theatre that has increasingly taken over the state's institution and mainstream theatre. Earlier, the Indian far right activists were more known for censoring and vandalizing the artwork from the outside. So earlier the intervention was more from the outside. They continue to do so, still they are continuing to do so. So if you are doing some good, some kinds of progressive plays, then it is becoming quite difficult in Delhi that how you can do the play, because maybe your plays are not going to get a space. You are not going to allow to perform in some college and things. So it is becomes a very direct way of censoring and stopping you to play, and that becomes some kinds of intervention from the outside, in which we can talk about that how they are still trying to vandalize or participate in this act of vandalism in that sense. But now it is becoming some kinds of more some kinds of some kinds of engagement from inside, and this inside makes a new kinds of departure in terms of right wing theater productions. So earlier they would be seen as antisocial or fringe elements. So that was the whole idea of the way critic used to engage with these people. They will say that oh, they are the fringe elements, they are the antisocial elements. But now they are the one who are at the helm of cultural affairs. So now you go after institution and after institution in Delhi or many parts of India, and you will find that they are the boss. They are the part of the cultural helm, and they are the people who are looking after these cultural institutions. And so they are now very much inside. So whatever earlier they were outside, now they are very much inside, and from inside they are hollowing out these institutions. The coming of and needless to say that there has been a complete takeover of the state arts institution. It also depends on how we read the theater of the far right, when public spaces themselves are getting theatricalized under the neoliberal right-wing ideology. So one is that we are seeing it because of neoliberal right-wing ideologies. We are seeing that how these spaces, I think you're talking about the body or spaces, all these things are getting theatricalized. So you have a more so not necessarily you are able to see theater on theater stage, but perhaps you are seeing more theatrical elements in the public culture or in a political culture, and that is becoming very general kinds of cultural phenomena nowadays. Theater of the far right can be read as an umbrella term for theatricalization of culture, and that is the distinction I'm trying to make. That when I'm saying about theater of the far right, then theater of the far right can be read as an umbrella term for the theatricalization of culture to serve the far right ideology at large. I analyze these connections in other place, but here I would like to go to just that how I see this whole rise of the or resistible rise of the far right theater. So political theater in India has a longer history and rich legacies with the Indian People's Theatre Association. And I know many of the audience are going to join from Bengal, and then you have a whole interesting legacy or quite rich legacy of Indian People's Theatre Association, playing a major role in anti-colonial struggle as well as in the shaping of post-colonial theatre culture. And that has been the history and legacies of IPTA. One can also discuss the contribution of the feminist theatre and anti-caste theatre works across social movements in many parts of India. It is not surprising that discourse of political theatre in India is shaped by the left and progressive ideology. So generally talking about across the world, one that when this debate was unfolding in UK, then UK also has a very similar history where when we discuss about theatre, largely we discuss about progressive liberal kinds of theatre. And that shapes your ideology and the structure of the theatre itself. Same has happened in India with IPTA making a major role and almost shaping the theatre culture in India. Whether you're thinking about whole anti-colonial struggle or post-colonial kinds of theatre, then that has been a kind of vantage point through which one talk about theatre aesthetics or some kinds of structures of theatre. One also finds nationalist theatre with right-wing sentiments. So it does not mean that earlier, theatre never had this right-wing or nationalist sentiments. That was very much there. So during the nationalist movement, and you have a whole different kinds of plays one can talk about, from Bhartendu to other kinds of playwright, and they used to have some kinds of nationalist sentiments in their plays. But again, I would say this is a new departure. A still play was happening in through different kinds of aesthetics. Mode of engagement was very different, but now the right-wing theatre is making a far right theatre is making a new kinds of departure, and I will try to show that how I am saying that they are able to make a new kinds of departure. So while Hindu mythical and religious themes were common in popular theatre culture in many of those plays, if you know that, and I know that you must be aware about that, like how mythical and religious themes were very much play part of the many of the plays. So, but again, and some of them are still continues. And for example, you also have famous, or one can say famous play in that way. It's called Me Nathuram Godse Bolte, I am Nathuram speaking. But again, the convention was that you are still trying to follow some kinds of convention of conventional theater or conventions of traditional theater, the way you use theater, and the way that becomes the structures of theater. But those plays were still conventional in their formats. Far right theater in India marks a new departure in virulent ways in which it is not attacking theater's radical ideology, but also subverting its forms by emptying them out. So now this does not remain a question about that you are just doing Nathuram Godse, a play on to celebrate Nathuram Godse, but you are also trying to make some kinds of departure in relation to aesthetics or structures of healing. One side it carries the counter-revolutionary ideology with the glorification of Vedic Brahmin culture, and then if you go to see the plays, and I had chance to watch some of these plays, then it's a full of Brahminical Vedic culture, and that gets celebrated in this place. And second, also and some kinds of backlash against the social justice discourse, some kinds of backlash against constitutional values, and all becomes crux of this plays. On the other side, it is also producing counter theater aesthetics, and that is one of my major concerns here, that how it is able to produce some kinds of counter theater aesthetics. Counter theater aesthetics can be read as an attack on the very ideals and forms of critical creative spheres of theater. So when we think about theater, then theater is not just a space. Theater is also a space. If you are looking through legacies of Bertolt Brecht and many other kinds of legacies, then theater was able to carve itself as some kinds of critical creative space in which theater was functioning in India and many parts of the world. So and therefore, now what counter theater aesthetics of the right wing is doing, that they are trying to attack the very ideals and very forms of critical creative sphere of theater by participating in it. So now they are not just trying to make some kinds of argument from outside or trying to do something from outside. By participating in it, they are trying to generate some kinds of critical, there's some kinds of counter theater aesthetics. So it is not only turning theater into a spectacle. So one, that is, it is turning theater into a spectacle, just some kinds of empty shows. And you have many examples. That examples I will come to. But the point is that, so one is you are trying to create a spectacle. The meaning of politics to serve the power, it makes theater instrumental. So what one, you are trying to make theater a spectacle out of theater, but you also trying to instrumentalize the theater itself. So, for example, myth has already been instrumentalized by the right wing. So, myth becomes if you myth always becomes interesting kinds of myth you're talking about, then one can say that myth is a complex thing where it unfolds several kinds of layers and things. But right wing ideology tries to instrumentalize the myth. Now they are trying to instrumentalize the theater aesthetics. It is able to produce some kinds of very mediocre and non-serious plays in that way. So there is a whole attempt. So if you go to see that, okay, if you are doing right-wing plays and you can be very serious about the theater, then there is a chance that you are still going to follow some kinds of a structure of theater. But the whole idea is that by participating and engaging with the theater, you are trying to kill the very spirit of theater. And that becomes a very some kinds of attack on the theater aesthetics itself. And that is the precise point I'm trying to make here. So it is able to produce some kinds of very mediocre, non-serious. So either you are thinking about director, you are talking about actors, either you are talking about their engagement with the scripts. So there has been deliberate attempt to not to engage in a deeper ways, because there is always a chance that if you are playwright, or even if you are coming from the right wing kinds of ideology, and then you are trying to engage with a you are trying to make some kind of very serious engagement, then there is a chance that theater can change you. And that is the whole idea, that theater is a space that is not you as an actor and director, you are transforming the space of theater, but theater as an entity, theater is a space also transforms you. But because you also have some kinds of fear, and fear of theater, so that fear will not let you to engage with the theater in a very interesting way or more in a complex ways. And therefore I think the engagement also becomes very mediocre in that ways, where you already have some kinds of fear. So you don't want to make that kinds of serious engagement with the theater, and therefore you are trying to make very mediocre engagement, very a superficial engagement, some kinds of instrumentalized engagement, and therefore you are able to appropriate this theater in that way. Otherwise, even if you are going to read Thomas play in an interesting way or in a complex ways, then I think the play does something to you. It can maybe change or maybe create very different kinds of emotions, where you perhaps could not do the play that you are doing, the right wing is doing. And that is the point that can make that how the superficial engagement is giving you some kinds of idea to create the spectacle, but also to instrumentalize the plays, where you don't want to make a very serious engagement with the theater itself. And that would be a kinds of my reading about far right theater. So far right theater in that way, for me, posits a very it creates some kinds of crisis at the level of ideology and aesthetics of theater. Ideology is very obvious, but also it creates a very posits a very interesting kinds of challenge, and I will say very violent kinds of challenge, that how what is going to be the modes of engagement of these aesthetics. But why there is a no, the question also comes many times, that why there is a no a scholarly engagement with far right theater, because generally if you are still, we know that a lot of work is happening in the field of theater, but largely there has been a whole engagement about around progressive theater, around some kinds of social justice theater, and that has been the primary sites. But if you see now the pervasiveness of these theaters, then far right is really leading the scenario. They are almost on the forefront, either across the stages, across the state institutions. This is the theater that has more popularity now. But again, what could be the fear of the theater critic, that why we should not engage with the far right theater? And then one argument could be that okay, because it is still in the very earliest stage, and then because the theater, this far right theater is still emerging, and therefore maybe in future time people will engage with this theater, and you have some scholarship that is coming. But again, because of also theater history, people don't want to engage with the far right theater. There has been a general apprehension in engaging with the far right theater in the left liberal scholarships, and that apprehension was that such theater is still treated as a lacking aesthetic. So that was the whole argument, that what exactly you are going to engage with. Suppose that if you are going to work on far right theater or Hindutva theater, then what is going to be the point of our engagement? And then that needs again serious kinds of approach, that what is going to be our approach. Are we going to have same approach the way we have approached either left wing theater or left theater, or more social progressive theater approach, or is it going to be very different? It needs or demands very different kinds of approach. And I will say that perhaps it demands very different kinds of approach. Not necessarily we can do some kinds of proper analysis of the far right theater, taking the similar kinds of approach, the approach we have adopted for for this either left leaning theater or for progressive social theater. Such theater is still, so there is a whole idea among progressive circle, left leaning circle, liberal circle, that okay, oh, what is the point of working on this theater, because that does not give you anything, it is lacking aesthetics. Same way, a theater having bad imitations, a very theater with a bad imitation, and then lacking critical distancing, because theater does not also have the critical distancing, and then perhaps it does not gives you a point of analysis, because many times you also want to engage with something that gives you some kinds of complex reading, that gives you some kinds of more one can say deep engagement in that way. But perhaps far right theater does not provide that kinds of complexities, and therefore there has been a whole some kinds of attitude in which scholars are still very apprehensive about engaging with these kinds of theater. And that then this whole idea would be that it is more about some kinds of emotional gratification. And that is because also there has been a whole debate about popular culture and theater. And then when you are talking about theater that is coming from more artistic background, then they would be very critical about popular culture, that okay, theater is something that is still leaves you a lot of a space for critical thinking, but not necessarily that a general popular culture. When we talk about, then it becomes the idea of some kinds of emotional gratification, or some kinds of part of the consumerist ideology, in which far right theater is still working. So it neither carries the legacies of the resistance nor the aesthetics of negativity, and therefore that apprehension also comes because of these kinds of connections. It is neither worth watching nor worth criticizing. That would be one way of approaching this idea, that why we are not scholars are not working on these kinds of theater. So this would be one. But again, if you're taking from, and that is what I take in my larger project, that but this has been a kind of general apprehension about far right cultural ideology or cultural sphere, that they are not that they are very simply provide, they are very instrumental, or they do a lot of very simplistic kinds of things. They're full of that kinds of gratification, that kinds of ideology, and then they create a spectacle. But that is where I think Susan Sontag argument becomes very interesting, where she talks about fascinating fascism. She says that it is not like, but again the question comes that why people are going to watch theater, why what kinds of appeal right wing theater is able to do. So one can say that okay, because right wing is able to provide some kinds of funding, they have some kinds of support, and therefore they are able to maintain some kinds of popularity or some kinds of presence. But I think saying that would not be enough. Far right theater is also having some kinds of able to generate some in danger, some kinds of aesthetics in which they are able to provide some kinds of a spectacle, and that a spectacle itself becomes fascinating. So maybe for critical readers, or maybe if you're going to analyze from many a scholarly viewpoint, then maybe that a spectacle that you are trying to denigrate or try to see that okay, that does not hold anything, I think that becomes the point of fascination for very popular kinds of culture, popular culture kind of cultural scenario, and that kinds of understanding. So in a way, it is neither. So one can say that it still carries a spectacle, it still carries fascination, and it still carries impact. And if it carries a spectacle, if carries fascination and impact, then definitely we need to engage. We need to read this theater, that what exactly far right theater is doing, and how that can be resisted. If it is a matter of resistance, then how that can be resisted. Because that should be, unless we don't understand that what is exactly right before right theater is doing in terms of some kinds of engagement with the audience. So we need to understand that exchange or mode of exchange, and then only one can think about making some kinds of intervention, either as a scholar, or either in terms of also in terms of in relation to some kinds of cultural intervention. Thus, it is the role of the intellectual to discuss it by means of criticism, whether we like it or not, and that is the point I want to bring here. It addresses some basic constitutive problem of theatre and aesthetics on the arrival of the far right theatre in India. What are the characteristics of the far right theatre? So now we can go to the characteristics. What are the characteristics of the far right theatre? What sorts of problem does it pose in relation to ideology and aesthetics? So one, that we are talking about characteristics of the far right theatre. Second, we are also talking about that what kinds of challenges it is posing to existing norms or existing some kinds of understanding of ideology and aesthetics, because one can also read it say anti-ideology, some kinds of theater that also carry some kinds of anti-feeling, but it is also can be termed as counter aesthetics in various ways, the way I'm trying to read it. It's also part of some kinds of counter revolution in which we can talk about, because it also tries to make a lot of backlash against the ideology of gender, ideology of anti-caste and things like that, and therefore counter revolution also becomes its a primary agenda in various ways. So now you have I will give you example that why I'm talking about this theater, and then first let me ask few more questions, and then we can go to the more examples. So this is in this talk I discuss about what sorts of problem does it pose in relation to ideology and aesthetics. Again, I'm repeating here, but how do we read them? What for example, if it is about reading and understanding far right theater, then what could be our approach? And that is what how we can complicate those approach. How do we understand what a good far right play? So what is going to be the example of good far right play? So suppose if you're talking about good left play, a good progressive plays, then we have some markers, we have some understanding. But think about what is going to be the good right wing play. So is it about the play that is going to get more instrumentalized and completely will try to counter the aesthetics, that is going to be a good play, or some kinds of maybe a play that is going to have a more able to bring some kinds of more effective kinds of connection in terms of on the questions of ethno-religious ideology in a more virulent ways. That is going to be the understanding of right way. So you have two examples here. One example will come from the play that I was talking about, Nathuram Godse Bolta Hai, Nathuram Godse speaking. So that is that going to be a standard right wing play with a whole format of the play theater itself, or when we are talking about more mediocre play, for example recently NSSD also did this whole Operation Sindoor. They did a play on Operation Sindoor. They're very mediocre, and that kinds of play where you are trying to create some kinds of a spectacle, trying to make some kinds of virulent and violent claims, and that becomes the point of So is it what is going to be the model to understand so-called good right-wing play or good mischievous right-wing play in that sense, and the discourse that we can go back to the debate that was unfolding in UK, that what is going to be, is there a possibility to have good mischievous right-wing play? So which is the good mischievous right-wing play through which we can talk about the question of aesthetics and ideology. Now I will go to some examples where things are becoming really very part of some kinds of popular cultural ideology of theater. Hindutva has been using various cultural strategies to fortify its ideology. Our scholars have discussed how it has appropriated and instrumentalized various cultural forms from myths, epics, rituals, festivals, food and dresses, and many other things. It has made cultural nationalism as a connecting point to reach out to various section from Savarnas, and they have and this is not the play that I'm talking about, some that is happening in a state institutions only, but it is happening across the kinds of a spectrum. So from plays based on Sardar Patel, you have many plays based on Sardar Patel, Ahilya Bai Holkar, Chanakya, Chhatrapati Shivaji, Veer Savarkar, to a staging of Samudra Manthan, Kargil War, Operation Sindoor, and adaptation of Tamas. Many plays that is coming through these right-wing perspectives, and that is becoming the crux of that new kinds of play making at the level of at the institution, various theater institution or various state institution at large, at least in Delhi, that scenario that I am witnessing. On 31st October 2025, the NSD presented a play to mark the 150th anniversary of Sardar Patel in Gujarat, Kevadia. Directed by again Chitranjan Tripathi, who is also director of the NSD, National School of Drama. The play Loh Purush, the play name was Loh Purush Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, was performed by more than 200 artists and technicians, attended by the Prime Minister Modi himself, along with the several high-profile leaders and bureaucrats. And just go to watch some of those kinds of fragments of the play, that what exactly was happening in the play. So massive characters, actors coming to the stage. It is look like full of light, and so it looks like light and so kinds of scenario in which Prime Minister is coming. They are having photoshops, photos and everything, and then with some kinds of one two some kinds of athletics movements or some kinds of movement play ends. So it does not go into the very process of the play itself. So that is what I'm saying. The whole questions of the aesthetics marker that I'm trying to make, that nowadays the play that largely the right wing is doing, in which they are not necessarily also participating in the very process of theater itself. So you are trying to not only one, that you are trying to make some kinds of engagement. So engagement itself becomes a mode of some kinds of disengagement, in which you are not trying to face the complexities of the play, but also you don't want to participate in the very process of the theater production, and that is also leading to that kinds of instrumentalization or some kinds of spectacle formations. The play based on Patel's life were also performed by various regional centers of NSD, from Maharashtra to Madhya Pradesh, to commemorate that day. Last year, the Ministry of Culture, under the banner of NSD, sponsored 75 performances of Nukkad Natak across the country to mark Rashtriya Ekta Divas. In 2025 also, you have NSD sponsored almost 75 plays, Nukkad Natak across India to mark Rashtriya Ekta Divas, National Unity Day. On 7th November 2025, the NSD performed another play, Operation Sindoor, again attended by the BJP leader, the Chief Minister of Delhi, and the Lieutenant Governor, along with the heads of the 3 defense forces. So again, it is becoming some kinds of part of that nationalism, hyper-nationalism, in which the plays are getting more instrumentalized without participating in the very process of the theater itself, and by facing that some kinds of challenges the theater genre itself poses to you or to the any theater makers for that matter. The list is almost inexhaustible now. You can give many lists, and I have many examples. It includes a widely acclaimed play by Chanakya by Manoj Joshi, Hey Mrityunjay, a play based on Hindutva ideologue Savarkar by Marathi director Diripal Lanjekar. Chanakya and Hey Mrityunjay can be considered as the model play of the far right theater. There are because they are considered very successful play from their standard. And that is the question that I'm trying to ask, that if Chanakya is considered a very good play from the right-wing standard, then what was the standard from their saying that is a good play? And that is the standard that we can talk about. Chanakya claimed that it is an electrifying call to embrace leadership, and that is what it claims. The poster of Chanakya claimed that It is in like promotional materials of Chanakya claim that it is an electrifying call to embrace leadership, unity, and vision in today's India. The promotion also claimed that it is just a play. It is not just a play. It is a movement. I will take perhaps like another 5-6 minutes. So hope this is fine. Naboni. Okay, all right. The play collapsed the timeline and places Chanakya as the one who dreamed for Akhand Bharat. Now, what is happening that you are also trying to one that I have talked about instrumentalization in a very different way. Now you have also I have also talked about that how not necessarily theater makers are participating in the process of theater itself. And third point is also about some kinds of process of dehistoricization that you are trying to dehistoricize the whole narrative itself. The play collapsed, the Chanakya play collapsed, the timeline, and places Chanakya as the one who dreamed for Akhand Bharat. Chanakya think about Chanakya, his time period, but again now Chanakya is becoming the hero or that some kinds of protagonist in a kinds of new India, and he is dreaming for Akhand Bharat. The play tries to establish Brahminical supremacy over the state, and that is becoming the crux of the play. In another play, here Mrityunjay, Savarkar is confronting, or Savarkar confronts Mritu, death itself, in a very allegorical way. Savarkar talks to death for his vision of the fatherland. Now, in that play, Hey Mrityunjay, Savarkar talks to death, that figure of the death, and for fatherland, he is trying to establish the fatherland, and that becomes the crux of the play. So here you have some kinds of narrative and some kinds of instrumentalization is happening, but that is giving you an idea that how this aesthetics can be read and what is going to be the marker of the new aesthetics of the right-wing plays. Who could have imagined? But again, some kinds of really things that really shocks me, and that's really many times hesitates me that who could have imagined that Nukkar Natak, a street theater, will be used by the far right groups to propagate their agendas. Now, many parts of India, right wing use a lot of Nukkar Natak, street plays, to propagate their agendas during the election time, but also during the other occasions. A street theater in India was almost a trademark of the left or other kinds of theater. So, nevertheless, a street theater has emerged as a major site of the right wing ideological encroachment. Right wing intervention in a street theater raises several questions. First, far right street theater groups are mushrooming across Indian cities and doing plays on the themes of love jihad, to national security, the citizenship bill, to for cow protection, and there are many examples. So here you have many Nukkar Natak that is getting done and getting enacted around these themes where you have full right wing elements, full of those right wing elements. So, and this was two examples. Now we can move to the third examples where more regional and indigenous theater, what we say regional and indigenous theater, they're also becoming site being sites of right wing appropriation. And in the name of many times decolonization or many times unifying the nation discourses, these plays are also coming from various regions. And one of the far right want to stage these cultural forms as a spectacle without engaging this. So you have a lot of theaters, such theaters is coming from northeast regions, also coming from various from Madhya Pradesh, from Chhattisgarh, taking these elements or these symbolisms of the indigenous theater, Adivasi theater, more community and regional theater. But again, agenda is very clear where they are coming with a very far right agenda, and they are also making any kinds of departure in terms of aesthetics. Such theaters are appropriating local heroes to serve the interest of cultural nationalism and ethnocentrism. These local heroes are usually pitted against their Muslim counterparts to reclaim the history as well as strengthen the narrative of us versus them. The very act of engagement becomes an act of emptying out of the forms and subjects. And this reminds you of that many of the play, if you know the history of Germany during the Nazi period and theater during the Nazi period, then they will do this German things play. Well, very famous kinds of very popular kinds of one right wing plays. So it also reminds you that kinds of construction where you are trying to create a very massive spectacle around the place. But what I'm also trying to say that how the theater, far right theater that I'm talking about, it is not just about happening in a state institution. It is not just happening. They have also appropriated the forms of a street theater, or they are like having a massive presence in a street theater in Karnataka. But they are also implicating and also many have a like a strong presence in regional theater, in like a folk theater, and these are the sites in which like they are able to like make some kinds of very strong presence. Now, to end this talk, I will just try to summarize that what exactly far right theater as a problem of aesthetics. What kinds of problem it is positing for like scholars. Far right theater poses a paradoxical aesthetics problem. To elaborate on it, we can go back to the question asked by Rainer in relation to the possibility of the far right theater in the UK, where he said that what will the far right theater look like? So let us go back to that question: that what will the far right theater look like? Would it look like a theater or like a spectacle or something else? And the question I'm trying to add here: so would it look like a theater or like a spectacle or something else? What kind of theater is it? If it is a theater itself, if it is a theater, then what kind of theater we are talking about? One can read it as an impossibility of the far right theater at the level of aesthetics. So one can still say that okay, they are doing theater, but still they are not doing theater like a theater in that sense. So first, it can be seen as a theater in a very like kinds of ideological ways. Second, it is far removed from theater and thus needs to be analyzed as a spectacle. Third, it is a theater mixed or dominated by a spectacle. And then we can go to like more like technical kinds of analysis that I do in theater in this article, in this essay, which will be like more coming like short part of the essay has already appeared in the EPW, but I think longer part will be coming very soon, where you will get a chance to read it in the more like threadbare way, where I'm trying to analyze that how far right theater is able to make some new kinds of departure in relation to aesthetics, but also in relation to theater itself. So I think I will stop it here and we'll try to take some questions if you have some questions, something. But hope I was able to make some sense for you. Thank you so much.
Am I audible, sir? Am I audible?
Yeah, you are very much. Yeah, you are very much audible, Navleen.
Okay. This was a thank you for the fascinating talk on the resistable rise of the far right theater in India. So, what I would like to say now is please post your questions, write down your questions in the comment section box, or if there are any comments to make, please write in the comment section box. We are waiting for your questions to come down, and so we'll definitely answer your questions. And please make it precise and to the point as well. So, sir, without
Yeah.
before the questions at the start coming in, I I was just noting down some of your points. Okay, so regarding your last point, that what does far right theater look like, or look like as a spectacle, the last point that you made, I was just thinking of a question. I may be wrong in my understanding that for you, in what ways does far right theater reconfigure the spectacle as a technology of governance, where visible sound and the bodily symphony are mobilized in stabilizing the majoritarian state power? And following that, another question naturally comes to mind: that how does the spectacle, which you deeply engage in this presentation, in far right theater, actually collapse the distinction of the difference between performance and a political event by transforming the theater into a continuous field of ideological rehearsal or ideological events? That's the first question I was just thinking.
Yeah, so thank you, Navanil. Yeah, so I was just thinking, like, so a spectacle remains one of the, like, one very visible kinds of marker if you're thinking about, like, far right theater, and that becomes, like, but again, the question is not that a spectacle. Question is about how we are going to engage with that spectacle. What is the spectacle? If a spectacle itself becomes substance, for that matter, suppose that a spectacle, we think about some kinds of empty significations or empty kinds of signifiers. So that becomes one way of reading the spectacle. But suppose if you are taking a spectacle as a substance itself, a spectacle as a body itself, and a spectacle is some kinds of marker and mobilizer itself, then I think we need to read a spectacle in a very different way. And therefore, when I'm saying that how right wing is producing a spectacle, one, that right wing is producing a spectacle in relation to theater, but right wing is also appropriating many times many already existing festival, for example, Kumbh Mela, as some kinds of major major a spectacle. But they are, in terms of formation of a spectacle, they are able to encode some kinds of ideology, mobilize in their own ways. And therefore, so what I'm trying to say, that a spectacle does not mean that just an act of emptying out. That becomes one of the ways of reading the spectacle. A spectacle is also substance. A spectacle also becomes a site of fascination, and that is what Susan Sontag would talk about, that they like a spectacle. A spectacle becomes the many a spectacle is also so cult figure may appear like a spectacle, but it is through the cult figure, and it is through the spectacle people are coming together. So generally, if you're thinking that very idea of the very Marxist idea of alienation, then you will see that should be a kind of reading that okay, a spectacle will alienate people because it is just a spectacle. It is a very instrumentalized ways of engaging with the things. But no, a spectacle is doing just opposite. It is just through the spectacle that people are coming together. It is through the scale people are coming together, and that becomes the interesting way of mobilizing the things. And therefore, when I'm saying that how far theater is producing a spectacle, then I'm not necessarily reading in a negative ways. Far right, through formation of the spectacle, they are able to mobilize the people, they are able to mobilize that audience. For example, just think about the people who are going to watch this theater, what exactly they are going to watch in theater. So one would be say that okay, many times when you go to watch theater, then you are trying to see some kinds of complexities or complex seeing in a theater. But no, that is not the idea. You are looking for a spectacle. You are looking for a moment of acrobatic movement. You are looking for some kinds of some kinds of fantasy that is going to emerge, some kinds of miracle that is going to happen. So that itself becomes a point of mobilization, and therefore that is what a spectacle is not necessarily resulting in some kinds of alienation. A spectacle becomes a point of engagement itself. It becomes a social relationship. To use a Guy Debord term, that a spectacle becomes a mode of engagement itself. But again, the speed here is not about when Guy Debord was talking about spectacle or society of a spectacle. Then he was still talking about that how that is going to become a part of some kinds of modes of social engagement in modern time, and that in capitalist society, and that was his take. But now the acceleration right wing is doing what right wing is changing is the speed of the spectacle, like a constant spectacle, a spectacle after a spectacle, and that becomes the modes of movement and engagement. And therefore you cannot also say that when we talk about a spectacle, then we cannot also say that it is not without body. A spectacle becomes the body, or your body turns into a spectacle, and that becomes the kind of point of connections that I'm trying to make. One, that performance and political, that is again a very interesting question, because then see, this has already has an history and debate about that he can performance politics and aesthetics can be seen in separation. And at least after writings of John Roncier, where here he talk about the politics of aesthetics, I think that debates is almost over. That both are sides, it is just about a matter of reading. Both are sides of distribution, both are sides of reconfiguration of spaces. So one is a reconfiguration of power, one is a reconfiguration of the body and spaces. So I think perhaps these four questions, and then right wing is making it in a more obvious ways. They do not hide this intention that okay, we are not doing politics. They are very much trying to bring the politics at the forefront, and that way they are going, I will say, 2 steps ahead of the left kinds of theater, where left will still try to show that okay, we are trying to do some practicing some kinds of politics through aesthetics. They will say that perhaps our politics is more aesthetical, and that becomes the idea that and that is what brings us to this Walter Benjamin idea, aestheticization of politics. So aestheticization of politics is the very core crux and center of that far right theater formations, and that is what we are witnessing. That it's like complete aestheticization of the politics, and therefore you are not able to see that which one is which, and then the distinction completely collapsed.
Right. And and sir, I was just reading your article. Yes, article is that published in the PW in the month of February. So
Yeah.
and you just discussed how this emergence of far right theater historically, especially street theater, has been associated with the leftist, progressive, and resistance politics. So I was just thinking regarding the point that how does this theater actually organize and extract the affective surplus, like the fear, the grievance, the wounded pride from its audience, from its spectators, and following this, in what sense are these audiences or the spectators are converted into merely laboring subjects, which which they actually reproduce ideology through their feeling, through the emotions, or through the gestures.
Yeah, so I missed your second part, so if you can just repeat the second part. Yes.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. In what sense are the spectators converted into laboring subjects who actually reproduce ideology to their feelings?
Yeah, yeah. And that is so that is the larger connections I'm trying to make. So theater becomes one side, but we can talk about other sides. And I think all these sides are very much interconnected. So for example, until recently, when we were watching either Kashmir file or Kerala file, then there was a whole debate about by God, what kind of cinema they are doing. This is just like a propaganda. But now you also have more, I will say, Dhurandhar, first part where not necessarily it is coming directly through the ideology. It is coming more through the aesthetics is becoming, or some kinds of positioning of the bodies or a staging are becoming more remarkable ways of bringing that politics. And this happens more, I will say, in the field of music. So for example, I'm also writing on H pop, Hindutva pop, in that way. So, for example, in Hindutva pop, not necessarily all the people, and you have very interesting accounts by Kunal Prohit, where he's saying that not necessarily people who are singers or doing these kinds of composition for right wing, like Hindutva kinds of pop, they're not necessarily part of the right wing. They are not necessarily even in touch of in a contact with BJP or that kinds of political organization. But again, whole atmosphere is getting either through media or through the climate, political climate we are living in now. It is getting all streamlined through some kinds of affect becomes a connecting modes through which you are you first you are writing, maybe you are just writing for your part of some kinds of creative economy, that you are just writing because you want to write. As one write love song, as one write erotic songs, as you one write devotional songs, same way with the same kinds of effect you are also writing a very Hindutva kinds of songs. But later maybe a chance that that Hindutva organization can provide you platform where you are directly getting implicated in that kinds of politics, but not necessarily that is the case. It is a larger part, larger atmosphere and ecology in which affect is working and connecting with each other. So from Hindutva pop to Hindutva cinema to full of that media to social media, all are feeding into each other, and that is also leading towards these kinds of construction of these kinds of theater aesthetics. And therefore, affect is the term. In fact, affect is the circulating term in which one can talk about. But again, the question comes that you're laboring bodies, and the question comes that what exactly is getting. So then again, it brings us to one. There will be two kinds of reading. One way of reading would be that a very Walter Benjamin ideas, that how that they can give you cultural expressions, but not necessarily distribution in the properties. And that becomes so okay. And because people are maybe it is they are jobless, they are more angry, and many times they are youth are full into these kinds of cultural productions. They are coming in a massive base, but also they are feeling getting some kinds of more participatory space. like if you're thinking about Est pop, Hindutva pop, then that is the space where you can come without any kinds of making a distinction that okay, you all can come and dance together. We are just coming and dancing. We are just like coming and participating in some kinds of things. But the point is that that is what they can give you. So they are giving you some kinds of equality in terms of expression, or equal some kinds of more, I would say, impunity in terms of expression. That okay, whatever ways you want to express or put your cultural expression, that is fine. But please don't talk about that, like question of labor, question of employment, questions of other things. So that gets completely subsided, and that becomes one of the and that is what history we can learn from the history of the far right movement across the world, where they will give you instant kinds of gratification at the cultural level in relation to cultural expressions, to hide the larger kinds of questions that in which one can talk about. I don't
Right.
know whether I answered your questions or not,
No, no,
but yes,
no,
this is
sir.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, yes, fine. And so you were saying that the theater uh, of the far right as an umbrella term, right?
Yeah.
So if, in that sense, I was just thinking, so how does far right theater then reconfigure the grammar of performance, especially the street theater, which is actually historically tied to resistance? And does this shift actually indicate the collapse of theater as a counter public space or not?
Yeah, that is what is happening. You're yeah. So counter public is one other ways of reading this whole idea, because that is where it was like it has a whole resistance history. Despite of all the plays we can talk about, like even they were using mythical plays, other kinds of plays, then theater and art will be read as some kinds of more is some kinds of alternative ideology, producing some kinds of alternative ideology, producing some kinds of alternative spaces, producing some kinds of counter public. So now counter public is getting collapsed. So there will be two kinds of reading. One kinds of reading would be that so is it just a collapse of theater? Is it just collapse of counter public? Is it collapse of theater? Is it just collapse of theater, or is it collapse of theater is also saying something more about collapse of counter public itself? So I think that connection needs to be brought in that way. That one so because we are not just talking about theater, we are talking about some kinds of a speech act. We are talking about some kinds of artistic production. We are talking about some kinds of alternative spaces, because theater is Nasiruddin Shah puts in a very interesting way. He used to say theater is a contact point where people meet, where people talk to each other. So that can also read as a theater. But what that contact point is doing, that becomes the questions. So if earlier if you had a contact point, then there was a whole idea about reading that contact points in a subversive ways. Then necessarily they are doing something in relation to counter public. But I think in terms of the ideology and atmosphere we are in, the ecology that we are in, I think not necessarily contact point is giving a guarantee that it is going to necessarily produce some kind of counter public. It can happen other way around, where they are going to produce some kinds of power, or going to support mobilizing some kinds of power in the street. And therefore I think most volatile stage is now a street. So a street
Right.
crisis is not just about a street theater. Crisis is about a street itself. So one is that just you are seeing the things that is happening in terms of a street theater, but what does the collapse of a street theater is saying in a larger context? And that becomes really really terrible kinds of contexts that we can talk about.
Right, right, right. Just give me a second.
So I think we don't
Answer.
have questions. No, but yeah, that's all right. Because I
No,
also, hmm, hmm.
no, no. I think till now we haven't received any questions or comments or stuff like that. But I would like to close with just final two questions because it's already 10 past 15 in the night. So I will just close it with the two questions. So regarding this point, I would like to close with this one, that with with this emergence of the far right theater, um, does this mark a new phase in Indian theater history, or does this in this new shift, eco-Orlean nationalist performance traditions, and how should the theater scholars or the archivists interpret such politically discharged uh, performances? Because how you, you do these far right formations capture and relocate these existing performative infrastructures
Yeah.
rather than inventing new ones or formulating new ones.
Yeah, so that is the way, like, in fact, in my reading, I see a new departure, like, completely very radical rupture, radical departure, because you are right that I also give examples in this article about that you already have nationalist theater, or that kinds of like a theater with nationalist sentiment, theater with like a very hyper nationalist sentiment to that extent that you already had plays about on around Nakam Borse, around all these like many other figures. So, but here, so still like you already had a play around like Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. So, but again, theater was happening in the language of theater itself, in the structure of theater itself. Now, the far right theater is also going against the very structure of the theater, like a very like a process of the theater, very like no idea of the body of the theater, the way like a body is to get a stage body of the theater. And that is what I'm trying to say, that it is not just about like it is about like some kinds of new formation of theater, but I think the very engagement is like doing something else, like can you produce theater without participating in its process? Can you produce like bring actor without like bringing the actor of the like bringing the theatrical body? So for example, like see the way many times the actor like leaders are appearing, a cult figure appears, then cult figures is almost appearing the way like lead like actor would appear. So if you're thinking through the figure of cult figure, then you can see the figure of actor is appearing, but actor is doing something else, and that is what. So three connections that we can make: one, that it is not like in far right theater, we don't see that theater is participating in its own process. In one, second, far right theater is like creating like whole idea is that you are deliberately doing something that will destroy the very structures of feeling that theater brings. Like some kinds of critical creative aspect, some species of dialogue, critical questioning for that matter. Like even if you want to produce right-wing ideology, that is fine. But again, point is that you are still trying to bring some kinds of critical debates. That okay, come, let us have debate, and that is to the point of departure. So, and in in bigger article, I also discussed that. But again, it's not also I will say ritual theater. Like one idea would be that okay, you are trying to bring myth, you are trying to bring ritual. I think that it is also anti-theater, like anti-ritual and anti-myth in that sense, because like even if you're thinking about like Greece Karnad will do like mythical plays like Nagamandala, other kinds of plays, but there he's just still trying to engage with the myth, like in a quite interesting way, where you can bring the more complexities or complex thing through the myth. But again, not necessarily. Far right theater will try to instrumentalize that myth, instrumentalize that body, instrumentalize that effect to target somebody, to make that division of the us and versus them. And that becomes a kind of like concerns, at least for me, at least like this is what I can see at like in present. Maybe like in future it will change, but that is the structure that I can see, that it is making some new kinds of departure.
Okay, so
Also the way like sorry, the way also it is to like people used to watch theater. So suppose the example I was giving about like some kinds of two plays, I will give you two example. I will give one play they did around Natya Shastra, like that Bharat Muni Natya Shastra, and then I think maybe NSD or Sahitya Natak Academy, they said that they gave this whole promotional idea that okay, just send us some photographs of Natya Shastra. Natya Shastra is like a manual of drama. It is not a play. But again, people were doing some kinds of photoshops with Bharat Muni. And they were just sending some kinds of photographs to Sahitya Academy, like Sangeet Natak Academy, perhaps, or Ministry of Culture, like one by one. So like you have not done any plays in terms of play also. You have done just maybe like some photoshops or maybe some kinds of a staging where like three four actors are coming together, one is becoming Bharat Muni and some are becoming like a son of Bharat Muni, and you are coming together having a photograph and posting that photograph as some kinds of proof of the play. So what exactly happened in that process? that play as an object is not remaining working as a play as an object. It is becoming something else, perhaps like a photograph, perhaps like some kinds of a staging, some different kinds of a staging in that sense.
Okay, so this one by Shruti Ghosh, and we will close with this question, and and that's what we will have for today's session. In what ways do we then redefine performance of resistance in the face of this capture of tools, forms, aesthetics? Shruti Ghosh. It's a question by Shruti Ghosh.
In what ways do we then redefine performance of resistance? Okay, in the face of the captures of tools, forms, and aesthetics. So one see, and that is what we can think about. That one, that so then does it mean that all the species of resistance disappeared? Does it mean that all the languages of theater has disappeared? I will say not necessarily. One, that of course right wing is trying to capture the tools, forms of aesthetics, but they are still, you still have your so, and that is the distinction I'm trying to make. That one, that still right wing is not doing the play the way left wing is to do, or left wing is to do, or the theater of the progressive social theater is to do. So they are still not my still I believe that if you're going to seriously engage with the theater as an object, then there is a chance that some kinds of criticality or critical engagement will happen, and in that moment of encounter something will happen to you also and to the theater also. So still that spaces remain left, and that spaces are very much there where people are still engaged with in a critical creative ways. People can still engage with the questions of theater in terms of contact. People can still engage with the theater, those theaters. But the point is that right wing is trying to carve their own space, one that they are trying to capture. So for example, they are trying to capture the spaces of a street theater, but it does not mean that Jannat Munch, Jannat Munch street theater disappeared. They are still very much there. They are still trying to engage with the questions of labor, questions of worker, and things like that. So I think both can go parallel, because it's also about we need to think about, it's also about we are participating. It's also about some kinds of class or some kinds of ideological kinds of conflict that one is participating into. So it does not mean that coming out of far right theater does not mean that others have completely disappeared, or others have been completely captured in that way. But again, the point comes that how you're going to resist these kinds of plays or these kinds of spaces that is getting colonized by the far right theater or colonized by these kinds of ideology in that sense.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, but Shruti, I think your questions needs much more I think discussions and analysis. But thank you for asking these questions. Hope I have I answered your questions in maybe in a very simplified ways.
No, thank you, sir, for the fascinating presentation, and uh, and we're thankful to all our viewers who just
So last
joined
time
in.
also, I think last time I first read your body on the barricades in your platform, this
Right, right, right,
platform, and
right,
then
sir.
book came, and same way I think this is also something that I'm doing new, and again I feel quite privileged and happy that I'm again sharing my work first time with you.
No, no, it's our privilege and honor, sir, that you have that you agreed it, to give a presentation, a lecture, and we conclude the session by extending our heartfelt gratitude to Sir Professor Brahma Prakash sir, for giving
Thank
us
you.
this fascinating lecture. And before we close down, the entire video of today's webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and it will also be shared to our Facebook page as well after few edits and stuff like that. So thank you, sir, for this
Thank
presentation,
you.
and thank
Thank you
you
so
to
much.
all the viewers. Good night, everyone. Good night, sir.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.